I was a plumber they refused to pay, so I shut off water to their entire building. But that single sentence doesn't capture the 3 months of sleepless nights, the mounting bills, or the cold satisfaction that would eventually flood through my veins like ice water through copper pipes. The invoice sat on my kitchen table for 6 weeks, growing more wrinkled each time I unfolded it. $23,000 for emergency repairs to the luxury high-rise on 5th Street. 3 burst pipes in the dead of winter, flooding 2 floors, threatening the entire heating system. I'd worked 72 hours straight, crawling through flooded basements, soldering joints in sub-freezing temperatures, saving their property from hundreds of thousands in water damage. Sterling Property Management had called me personally. Not through the usual channels, not through the building's regular maintenance crew. They'd heard about my reputation. The guy who could fix anything, who worked through the night, who never left a job half-finished. The building manager, a thin man with nervous eyes and expensive shoes, had shaken my hand afterward, promising payment within 30 days. Standard commercial terms, nothing unusual. The first call came on day 35. A receptionist's voice, professionally detached, explaining that my invoice was being processed. These things take time, she assured me. The system was slow but reliable. Day 45 brought another call. Same voice, same explanation. A delay in the accounting department. The check would be cut by the end of the week. By day 60, the receptionist recognized my voice before I'd finished saying my name. The excuses became more elaborate. The accounting software had crashed. The person who signed checks was out sick. The invoice had been misplaced and needed to be resubmitted. I resubmitted it, twice. The final call came on day 78. A different voice this time, male, confident, dismissive. The work had been deemed unsatisfactory. They were disputing the charges. I could file a complaint with the Better Business Bureau if I wanted, but Sterling Property Management would not be paying this invoice. Unsatisfactory work. The pipes hadn't burst again, had they? The heating system had run flawlessly through the rest of winter. The basement was dry, the building was warm, and 2 floors of luxury condos were generating their monthly fees without interruption. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at that wrinkled invoice. $23,000 represented 6 weeks of work, materials, emergency labor rates. It was also 3 months of my mortgage, my truck payment, my insurance premiums. Small business margins don't allow for clients who simply decide not to pay. The anger came slowly, like water seeping through a crack in the foundation. At first it was just frustration, the familiar sting of being taken advantage of. But as the days passed, as I ate ramen noodles for dinner and counted change for gas money, the frustration crystallized into something colder, more purposeful. I'd spent 15 years building my reputation. I'd crawled through sewers, fixed midnight emergencies, worked holidays and weekends. I'd been honest, reliable, fair. And Sterling Property Management had decided that none of that mattered because they could simply choose not to pay. The idea came to me while I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, calculating how long I could keep my business running without that payment. Sterling Property Management managed 17 buildings in the downtown area. I'd worked on most of them over the years. Emergency calls, routine maintenance, system upgrades. I knew those buildings better than their own maintenance staff did. The first step was research. I drove past the 5th Street building 3 times over the next week, studying the exterior, noting the service entrances, the utility connections. The building had been constructed in 1987, renovated in 2003. I'd been part of that renovation team, upgrading the plumbing systems, modernizing the water mains. I remembered the layout. The main water supply entered through the basement, fed through a series of shut-off valves and pressure regulators. The emergency shutoffs were located in a utility room that most people couldn't find without a blueprint. But I'd installed half of those valves myself. The building housed 42 luxury condos, each worth well over $1 million. The ground floor contained a high-end restaurant, a boutique law firm, and Sterling Property Management's main offices. Wealthy residents, successful businesses, all depending on a continuous supply of clean water. I made a list of everyone who would be affected. The families with small children, the elderly residents, the restaurant staff, the lawyers, the office workers. Then I thought about the $23,000 Sterling owed me, and the arrogance in that man's voice when he told me the work was unsatisfactory. The building's water system was protected by a standard lock on the utility room door. I'd installed that lock during the renovation. I still had the key. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a plan, not just to shut off the water, but to do it in a way that would cause maximum inconvenience while maintaining plausible deniability. I studied the building's occupancy patterns, noting when residents left for work, when the restaurant received deliveries, when the office workers arrived. The key was timing. Too early, and the problem would be discovered and fixed before anyone really felt the impact. Too late, and the building's maintenance crew might be on site to respond quickly. I needed to hit that sweet spot where the disruption would be maximum, but the response would be delayed. I also needed to make sure the problem couldn't be easily traced back to me. The building had security cameras, but I knew their blind spots. I'd been in and out of that utility room dozens of times over the years, always with legitimate business. One more visit wouldn't raise suspicions, especially if I was careful about timing. The plan began to take shape. I would shut off the main water supply during peak morning hours, when residents were showering, the restaurant was preparing for lunch service, and the office workers were settling in for the day. The confusion would be immediate, the frustration mounting by the hour. But I wouldn't stop there. Sterling Property Management had decided to play hardball, to bet that a small plumber couldn't fight back against a corporate entity. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I spent the next week gathering intelligence. I called the building's regular maintenance company, posing as a potential tenant interested in the reliability of their services. The conversation was enlightening. They were understaffed, overworked, and routinely took 6 to 8 hours to respond to non-emergency calls. Water outages weren't considered emergencies unless they involved flooding. Perfect. I also researched Sterling Property Management's other buildings. 17 properties, all downtown, all with similar water systems, all vulnerable to the same kind of disruption. The company's entire business model depended on maintaining the illusion of luxury and reliability. A simultaneous water outage across multiple buildings would shatter that illusion. But I needed to be strategic. Too many outages at once would attract attention, possibly trigger an investigation. I needed to space them out, make each one seem like a separate incident. Equipment failure, aging infrastructure, routine maintenance gone wrong. The first target would be the 5th Street building where I'd originally done the work. That was personal. The other buildings would follow over the next several days, each outage carefully timed to maximize impact while minimizing suspicion. I made detailed notes about each building's water system, the locations of shutoff valves, the security measures in place. Some buildings had better security than others. Some had newer systems that would be harder to sabotage. I ranked them by difficulty and potential impact. The 5th Street building remained at the top of the list. It was the most vulnerable, the most symbolic, and the one I knew best. It would be my opening statement. As the plan solidified, I found myself sleeping better. The anger was still there, but it was focused now, channeled into something productive. Sterling Property Management thought they could steal from me without consequences. They were about to discover how expensive that mistake would be. I spent the final week before execution, preparing my tools and refining my timing. I would need to move quickly once I started, with no room for hesitation or second-guessing. The utility room keys were tested and retested. The route to each building was mapped and memorized. The excuses for being in the area were rehearsed until they sounded natural. The night before I began, I sat in my kitchen one last time, looking at that wrinkled invoice. $23,000. 3 months of my life. Years of reputation building, reduced to a bad debt that no one would ever pursue. Sterling Property Management had made their choice. Now I would make mine. The morning of the first shutdown, I woke at 5 a.m. and dressed in my standard work clothes. Tool belt, company shirt, clipboard in hand. I looked exactly like what I was, a plumber heading to a job. The building's security cameras would record nothing unusual. The drive to 5th Street took 12 minutes. I parked 3 blocks away in a public lot that didn't have security cameras. The walk to the building was casual, unhurried. I'd done this hundreds of times before, carrying tools to fix problems instead of create them. The service entrance was exactly as I remembered. The keypad code had been changed since the renovation, but the backup key was still hidden in the same location. Building managers never changed everything at once. Too much risk of locking themselves out. The utility room was in the basement, down a narrow corridor past the laundry facilities. The fluorescent lights flickered as I walked, casting intermittent shadows on the concrete walls. The sound of my footsteps echoed slightly, but the basement was empty. It always was at this hour. The door to the utility room was painted industrial gray, with a simple sign reading "Authorized Personnel Only." I'd painted that sign myself during the renovation. The lock was a standard commercial deadbolt, nothing sophisticated. My key turned smoothly, the bolt sliding back with a soft click. Inside, the utility room hummed with mechanical noise. Pumps, pressure regulators, monitoring equipment. The water main ran along the back wall, protected by a series of shut-off valves. The main shut-off was clearly labeled, painted bright red for emergency access. I stood for a moment, listening to the steady flow of water through the pipes. Hundreds of gallons per minute, feeding 42 luxury condos and 3 commercial spaces. This was the jugular vein of the building's comfort and convenience. The main shut-off valve was a simple quarter-turn mechanism. Clockwise to close, counterclockwise to open. I'd explained this to the building manager during the renovation, showing him how to shut off the water in case of emergency. He'd nodded along, clearly not paying attention, more interested in the cost than the mechanics. I pulled out my pipe wrench and positioned it on the valve stem. The metal was cold under my hands, slightly damp from condensation. One quick turn, and the water would stop flowing. One turn, and Sterling Property Management would start learning the cost of their arrogance. But I didn't turn it yet. This moment deserved to be savored. For 3 months, I'd felt powerless, frustrated, ignored. Now I held the building's lifeline in my hands. Everyone upstairs, the wealthy residents, the successful businesses, the smug property managers, they all depended on what I did next. I thought about the man who told me my work was unsatisfactory. I wondered if he lived in this building, if he was upstairs right now, preparing for his day, completely unaware that his shower was about to run dry. The valve turned easily, $23,000 worth of easy. The change was immediate but subtle. The steady hum of water flow began to fade, replaced by the gurgling sound of pipes draining. In the building above, shower heads were starting to sputter. Faucets were running dry. Toilets wouldn't refill. I stayed in the utility room for another 5 minutes, listening to the pipes empty. Silence was beautiful. 15 years of honest work, and it had taken me 30 seconds to create more disruption than I'd prevented in my entire career. Before leaving, I made one final adjustment. I partially reopened the valve, allowing a trickle of water to flow through the system. Not enough to restore normal service, but enough to make the problem seem like a pressure issue rather than a complete shutoff. The building's maintenance crew would spend hours trying to diagnose the problem, checking for leaks, testing pressure regulators, never thinking to check the main shutoff valve. The walk back to my truck was leisurely. I'd just begun a war, but I wanted to look like a tradesman heading home from a routine job. Nothing suspicious, nothing memorable. Just another plumber in a city full of them. By the time I reached my truck, my phone was already ringing. The building manager, his voice tight with stress, explaining that they were having water pressure issues throughout the building. Could I come take a look? Emergency rates, of course. Time and a half. I told him I was booked solid for the next 3 days, but I could try to squeeze him in later in the week. Standard response for an emergency call. Nothing unusual, nothing that would connect me to the problem. He was desperate enough to offer double emergency rates. I told him I'd see what I could do, but I made no promises. Let him sweat. Let him beg. Let him offer me more money in one morning than Sterling Property Management had stolen from me over 3 months. The second phase of my plan began immediately. While the 5th Street building dealt with its water crisis, I began preparing the next target. The Merchant Tower, 12 blocks away, managed by the same company. Another building I knew intimately, another system I'd helped install. But first, I wanted to watch the chaos unfold. I drove to a coffee shop across the street from the 5th Street building and ordered a large coffee. The outdoor seating gave me a perfect view of the building's entrance. Within an hour, the disruption was visible. Residents began emerging from the building, some still in bathrobes, others dressed but clearly frustrated. The restaurant's staff gathered outside, smoking cigarettes and making animated gestures. A maintenance van pulled up, followed by a plumbing truck from a company I recognized. The building manager appeared at the entrance, pacing back and forth while talking on his phone. Even from across the street, I could see the tension in his posture, the way he kept running his hand through his hair. By noon, the situation had escalated. A second plumbing truck arrived, then a third. The building's lobby was filled with maintenance workers, residents, and what appeared to be building management executives. The restaurant had closed for lunch service, a sign posted on the door apologizing for the inconvenience. I finished my coffee and drove to the Merchant Tower. The next phase of my education program was about to begin. The Merchant Tower was newer than the 5th Street building, constructed in 1998 with more modern security systems, but I'd been part of the team that upgraded its plumbing in 2019, installing new pressure regulators and emergency shutoffs. The building's water system was actually more sophisticated than the 5th Street buildings, which made it more vulnerable to the right kind of sabotage. The security cameras were better positioned, but I knew their blind spots. The utility room was on the third floor instead of the basement, accessible through a maintenance corridor that connected to the parking garage. I'd used that route dozens of times during the renovation. This time I waited until evening. The building's commercial spaces closed at 6 p.m., and most residents were home from work. Peak usage time for water systems. The disruption would be immediate and unmistakable. The parking garage was dimly lit, designed more for function than security. I walked through it with purpose, tools in hand, looking like any other maintenance worker. The elevator to the third floor required a key card, but I'd kept mine from the renovation project. Property management companies rarely updated their security databases. The utility room in the Merchant Tower was larger than the one on 5th Street, filled with more sophisticated equipment. Digital monitoring systems, automated pressure controls, backup pumps. All of it designed to prevent exactly what I was about to do. But sophisticated systems have sophisticated vulnerabilities. Instead of simply shutting off the main water supply, I reprogrammed the pressure control system. The building's water pressure would fluctuate wildly, surging and dropping at random intervals. Pipes would hammer, fixtures would spit and sputter, and the building's residents would experience the kind of plumbing nightmare that insurance companies hate to cover. The programming took 15 minutes. I accessed the control system through a maintenance panel, adjusting the pressure parameters to create maximum chaos while maintaining plausible deniability. To anyone investigating, it would look like a software glitch or equipment malfunction. As I worked, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Sterling Property Management's accounting department. The dismissive tone, the casual way they decided that my work was unsatisfactory. I wondered if any of their executives lived in this building, if they were about to experience their own plumbing emergency. The programming was complete. I reset the system's clock to delay the changes by 2 hours, giving me time to leave the building and establish an alibi. Then I walked back through the parking garage, taking the same route I'd used dozens of times before. By 9 p.m., the Merchant Tower was in chaos. I watched from my truck, parked 2 blocks away, as emergency vehicles arrived. The building's lobby was flooded from burst pipes. Residents were evacuating their apartments, carrying suitcases and looking shell-shocked. The local news arrived within an hour. A reporter interviewed the building manager, who stammered through an explanation about equipment malfunctions and aging infrastructure. The reporter nodded sympathetically, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. 2 major plumbing disasters in the same day, both managed by the same company? That was either terrible luck or something more systematic. Phase 3 began the next morning. The Sterling Property Management office was located on the ground floor of the 5th Street building, which was still without full water service. Their staff was working in a building that smelled like stagnant water and backed up sewage. Perfect. I called their main number and asked to speak with the executive who'd refused to pay my invoice. The receptionist, sounding frazzled, explained that he was dealing with multiple building emergencies and couldn't take calls. I left my name and number, along with a message that I might be able to help with their plumbing problems. The callback came within an hour. The same voice that had dismissed my invoice now strained with desperation. He needed emergency plumbing services across multiple buildings. Could I respond immediately? Money was no object. I told him I'd need to see payment for my previous work before I could take on any new jobs. Standard business practice. He actually sputtered, apparently shocked that I would mention the unpaid invoice at a time like this. I hung up on him, the same way he'd hung up on me 3 months ago. The next 2 days brought a steady escalation. 3 more Sterling Property Management buildings experienced catastrophic plumbing failures. Each one was different. A backup system failure at the corporate plaza, a pressure surge that destroyed fixtures at the Riverside complex, a complete water main rupture at the Harborview Apartments. Each incident was carefully planned and perfectly executed. I moved through the buildings like a ghost, using my knowledge of their systems to create maximum disruption with minimal evidence. Security cameras recorded nothing suspicious. Building logs showed no unauthorized access. The failures all appeared to be equipment malfunctions or acts of God, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. 7 buildings, all managed by the same company, all experiencing major plumbing disasters within a week. The local news began investigating, interviewing residents and business owners about Sterling Property Management's response to the crisis. The interviews were brutal. Residents complained about poor communication, inadequate emergency response, and a general sense that the company was in over its head. Business owners talked about lost revenue, damaged inventory, and customers who would never return. Sterling Property Management's stock price began to fall. Insurance companies started investigating. The mayor's office announced a review of building safety standards. And through it all, I watched from the shadows, a plumber who had become a force of nature. The final phase of my plan was the most personal. I wanted to sit down with the executive who had refused to pay my invoice, to look him in the eye as his world collapsed around him. But I needed to be strategic about it. Direct confrontation would be satisfying, but it would also connect me to the disasters. Instead, I waited. I knew that eventually, desperation would drive him to me. Sterling Property Management was hemorrhaging money, losing tenants, facing lawsuits. They needed a plumber who could fix their problems, and I was the best one in the city. The call came on a Friday morning. The executive himself this time, not his receptionist. His voice was different now, stripped of its earlier arrogance. He needed to meet with me immediately. He was prepared to discuss all outstanding issues, including payment for previous work. I agreed to meet him at a restaurant near the 5th Street building. Neutral ground, public space, but close enough to the scene of his troubles that he couldn't ignore the connection. He was waiting when I arrived, looking like a man who hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his face pale and drawn. He stood up when he saw me, extending a hand that I chose not to shake. We sat across from each other at a corner table, the kind of spot where business deals are made and broken. He ordered coffee with shaking hands while I simply watched him, saying nothing. The silence stretched between us until he couldn't bear it any longer. He began talking, his words tumbling out in a rush. The disasters had been unprecedented, he said. Equipment failures across multiple buildings, all at the same time. The company was doing everything possible to resolve the situation, but they needed help from qualified contractors. I listened without responding, letting him pitch his desperation to me like a sales presentation. He talked about emergency rates, expedited payments, long-term contracts, everything he'd refused to offer when I was the one who needed help. When he finished, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the original invoice, wrinkled and stained from 3 months of handling. I unfolded it carefully and placed it on the table between us. $23,000 for work that had saved his company hundreds of thousands in water damage. Work that he'd declared unsatisfactory when it came time to pay. He stared at the invoice, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally a dawning understanding. His eyes lifted to meet mine, and I saw the moment when he realized who I was, what I'd done, and why I'd done it. The silence returned, but it was different now. Heavy with recognition, thick with the weight of consequences. He reached for his checkbook, his hands trembling slightly as he wrote out the amount. $23,000 plus interest, plus the additional fees that had accumulated during his refusal to pay. He tore out the check and slid it across the table. I picked it up, folded it carefully, and placed it in my wallet. Then I stood up, ready to leave. But he grabbed my wrist, his grip desperate and pleading. He began talking again, faster now, about the other buildings, the ongoing disasters, the emergency contracts he was prepared to offer. Premium rates, immediate payment, anything I wanted. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then back at his face. For 3 months, I'd been the one asking for what I was owed. Now he was begging me for help, and the reversal was more satisfying than I'd imagined. I pulled my wrist free and walked away, leaving him sitting at the table with his untouched coffee and his crumbling empire. The disasters would continue until his company learned to honor its commitments. The water would flow again when Sterling Property Management remembered that some people don't forgive and forget. Outside the restaurant, I stood for a moment in the afternoon sun, feeling the weight of the check in my wallet. $23,000 finally paid. But more than that, I felt the satisfaction of a job well done. A different kind of job than I was used to, but one that required the same skills, knowledge, precision, and the ability to make things work exactly as planned. The war wasn't over. Sterling Property Management would continue to struggle with their plumbing problems until they learned to treat their contractors with respect. But the first battle was won, and I was no longer just a plumber they had refused to pay. I was the plumber who had shut off water to their entire world and made them beg for the privilege of turning it back on. The drive home was peaceful. I'd spent 3 months learning what it felt like to be powerless, to be ignored, to have my work dismissed as worthless. Now I knew what it felt like to hold someone else's comfort and security in my hands, to make them understand that every system they depended on was only as strong as the person who built it. Sterling Property Management had thought they could steal from me because I was just a plumber, just a small business owner who wouldn't fight back. They'd learned that plumbers know where all the pipes are, where all the valves are, and exactly how to make everything stop working. Some lessons are expensive, some lessons are wet, and some lessons are worth $23,000 plus interest. The water had been turned off, but the real lesson was just beginning to flow.